Unit 1. In Unit 1, we learned about what globalization was. That is the interconnected nature of the world around us and how it affects everyone's identities. There are two types of identities, individual and collective. Individual, what makes you you. Collective, what makes your group a group. Because of globalization, these two things have been affected. The positive ways they've been affected because of globalization is acculturation, which is accepting, root word, accepting cultures. We are accepting cultures into our space. We are creating accommodation for them, which is creating space for other cultures. Because of that, we have things like diasporas that have been created, which is another fancy way of saying that you just have a group of an ethnicity all living together. We've also got hybridization, which is taking two separate things and creating something new. Our case study would be the Métis, our Francophone and Indigenous, coming together to create a whole new ethnicity, a whole new culture, being the Métis. Some negatives of globalization affecting identity would be assimilation, root word meaning making them more and more similar. Case study that we focused on very heavily, residential schools, taking away language, culture, identity, all of those things. End goal being homogenization, where there is no differences and everyone are one singular group. These are the negatives of globalization, and we focus on those through 4 different dimensions. Social, meaning the people. How does it affect the people? Economic, how does it affect the trading of resources and goods and services? Political, how does that interact with our governments? And environmental, how is that affecting our environment in the long run? Case study we focused on in Unit 1 was the banana trade. This is the modern day representation of how globalization is affecting the identity of the Ecuadorian people. We have poisons being dumped on them. We have labor laws being unregulated. We have all of these things that have caused mass issues in other developing countries because of globalization. That was our main focus in Unit 1. But we needed to know how we got there, which is Unit 2. The starting of globalization is round 1. That's just trading of goods and services. We had the Silk Road going through Euro-Asia area. People were talking to one another. They were trading spices. They were trading goods. And then all of a sudden people were like, hey, do you know we use this Arabic numbering system? Math. And then they are like, well, that's good because we don't speak each other's languages. So let's deal with currency and trading it that way. So goods and ideas started going. Then we get our first kind of round of our first kind of force of globalization show up in full force, which was technology. We had the introduction of sails, compasses, things like that, which got people moving. The idea of getting new and improved things to go. So that was round 1. Then round 2 happens, which is our first expansion of people throughout the globe. This is what is known as historical globalization, starting in 1492 when Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Pause. Hello? Yeah, betcha.
Also scroll. Make it like scroll, you know, like the office.
Zubair, Mr. Crane wants you. Okay, so, where was I? Okay, 1492, Columbus starts sailing the ocean blue. And he does this for 3 reasons, and that's what most explorers are doing it for 3 reasons. God, gold, and glory, your 3 G's. So some Christians said, let's spread the word of Christ. The Muslims said, let's spread the word of Islam. All of these things, they start going into other countries. And because technology, one of our main forces of globalization, is expanding, we enter into the Industrial Revolution. So now we need lots of resources, we need lots of workers, we need all of these things. So the Industrial Revolution takes off. Everything starts expanding. Colonies start expanding. We start seeing people go into other countries based off of 2 reasons. Ethnocentrism, which is the idea that your race is better than others, and Eurocentrism, meaning the idea that the European culture and ideas and things are better than others. So what happens is the Berlin Conference. The Berlin Conference, led by a certain Belgian man. Who is he? King Leopold II gets this together. He gets the European countries all together, and he says, hey, let's scramble up this Africa. Let's hungry hippos it. They start creating new boundaries, new borders that didn't exist before. And all of that completely changes the cultural understanding and the identities of all the African people, because there's no real reason why people from the Congo should ever be speaking French. They did that because of the legacies left behind. So we know King Leopold treats the Congolese people terribly, he rips rubber off their skin, he does all of this because the Industrial Revolution has a massive desire for rubber. So once people start seeing that King Leopold is using his resources properly, and for his benefit, the slave trade begins. Slave trade at the beginning is very different. It starts with only people who are criminals and who owe mass debts to people become slaves. But with King Leopold showing that human resource can be used in your colonies, we get the birth of the transatlantic slave trade, which is our Portuguese and our Spanish and our British go to Africa, take the actual African people, and depopulate Africa using that human resource as a way to expand their empires. Britain does it a little bit differently in a place like India, where they go into India and they do indentured slavery, which is where you take your slaves, distribute them into your colonies, and then give them a contract, basically saying you work for 7 to 12 years, after that you become a citizen. India sees this eventually as an issue when our first ever transnational corporation, the British East India Company, monopolizes the cotton and textile industry and ruins the Indian economic system. Once that happens, a little dude named Gandhi pops up and says, hey, maybe we do self-sufficiency and we don't take the goods and services provided by East India and we provide it all ourselves. East India then loses all its resources, it doesn't have as much profit, they don't see the necessity of staying, so they decolonize. After that, India separates, it has the partition where they separate and Pakistan is created, and another diaspora, because of the identities presented in globalization, is created in the form of the Muslim Pakistan and the Hindu India. Now, this continues, we start seeing that globalization is leaving terrible legacies behind. We have people not getting a fair distribution of wealth. We have people not getting the same kind of equity that the colonies are giving to their colonizers. Mercantilism is running wild. You have colonies making all of the money. The countries that have been colonized absolutely destroyed economically, which causes a lot of civil strife, leads us to World War I, where people are like, colonizing is stupid, let's get rid of it. Then the Great Depression, because nobody knows how to run their economies. And then World War II. World War II eventually leads towards the end of historical globalization because people say, hey, this is stupid, what if we all just work together and we combine everything so that people are less likely to murder? Because of the Great Depression, we also start seeing the rise of economic globalization because people say, that was a bad idea, we should probably regulate. This comes from a guy named John Maynard Keynes, who believes in the boom-bust theory. He says that in times of great prosperity, we increase taxes, we decrease spending, creating a piggy bank, and then in times of recession, we decrease taxes so people can spend their money and the government spends money getting them jobs. Then another guy reads that and is like, that is a stupid idea, I hate that totally. His name is Friedrich Hayek, and he says, Hayek to the government, no government involvement, that's the worst way. Capitalism, created by Adam Smith, is the way to go, that's how strong survive. And then a guy named Milton Friedman comes up and he's like, there is a middle ground. Maybe we just deal with international trade and dealing with each other rather than being super involved in the government or in the economy. Leading us to economic globalization, which is from 1945 till now, also known as contemporary globalization, and that began at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1945, where all the 44 countries got together and they decided to create the General Agreements on Trades and Tariffs, which later would become the World Trade Organization in 1995, the World Bank, which deals with large-term loans and countries who need help, and the IMF, which deals with currencies and small loans. Those are all created. The world intertwines its economies because you're less likely to nuke a country if they owe you $20 billion. Then our economic globalization continues. We start seeing that maybe globalization was, and the legacies left by globalization in Unit 2 and historical globalization have really put a detriment onto the developing countries. So the UN becomes the measure of this marker, and they create the Human Development Index, which measures sustainability, knowledge, quality of life and standard of living. All of those things measure where each country is, and we start seeing the UN sustainability goals that they are having where they're trying to make more equitable, more realistic and sustainable practices in globalization where one group isn't being very positive over another group. Now, this is where we get into our ethical citizenship and why we learn these things so that the future generations can see these disparities and come up with ways to sustainably develop both environmentally with resources and with climate change, and economically with our differences in prosperity and poverty levels, and socially where people are no longer dealt with based off of the color of their skin and their ability to live in certain places, and politically when we realize that certain governments and certain ideas are not equitable practices. Ethical citizenship, because of globalization, is where we are at now. Boom. Thank you. Nailed it.